So the big story of the moment, the International Court of Justice today expected to reveal whether South Africa's provisional measures are granted in its genocidal intent case against Israel. Tel Aviv's military offensive on Gaza follows a surprise attack on October 7th by Hamas, which killed 1,200 people and saw over 2,000 hostages taken in. 200 hostages, I beg your pardon. Now, nearly 26,000 people have been killed in Gaza since. Let's unpack what's at stake. Bring in our guest, attorney and legal analyst, advocate Modidima Mannya joins us now, as well as international relations expert Ayesha Kajee. To both our guests, thanks very much indeed for your time. It's lovely to have you on the program. And Advocate Mannya, let me begin with you, because so much has been said about the hurdles that need to be crossed for South Africa to emerge successful here. As a start, the court needs to make some kind of comment or pronouncement on issues to do with jurisdiction and whether or not there is in fact a dispute between the two parties here that are signatories to the 1948 Genocide Convention. How difficult do you reckon it is to cross that hurdle?
Yes, good morning and good morning to your viewers. I don't necessarily think it's an issue. I think the state of Israel is basically clutching at straws. Firstly, Israel and South Africa are signatories to the Genocide Convention. Both of them have got obligations. South Africa has got an obligation to prevent a genocide where it occurs. Now, that alone is a ground of jurisdiction. I think the state of Israel seeks to argue that the conflict is between them and Hamas, and that South Africa is not a party to the conflict, which is a very tired, unfounded type of argument. So I don't think South Africa will have difficulty having the court to find that it has jurisdiction. In fact, the ICJ has jurisdiction.
Right. And, you know, of course, today we're expecting to hear the outcome of these interim provisional measures that South Africa has asked for, Ayesha, and not necessarily whether or not Israel is guilty of genocide. Among the injunctions that South Africa is asking for, is there to be adequate humanitarian aid that includes food supplies, medical supplies, water, fuel, hygiene supplies, etc., which in my mind is pretty easy to measure.
Absolutely. Basically South Africa's case has to be proven to be probably genocidal. And given what we've seen unfolding on our screens over the past 3.5 months, I think that case can be conclusively made and has been conclusively made. As Advocate Mannya has said, the technicality on which Israel has based the bulk of its case, that South Africa doesn't really have a dispute with it, is essentially clutching at straws. It is a measure designed to persuade the court that because there's a technical issue, the court should not rule on this, and particularly on the urgent provisional measures that South Africa has asked for. Now, given, as you said, that these urgent provisional measures are very simple, a cessation of hostilities by Israel in the Gaza Strip and the allowance of food, water, power, medical and humanitarian assistance into the enclave, which, as we know, is largely an open-air prison, an open-air concentration camp. And given the huge numbers of casualties and injured since October 7th, this is really, it's a no-brainer, as it were. If the court doesn't actually grant at least some of the 9 provisional measures that South Africa has asked for, it is going to be laying itself open to a charge of incredible hypocrisy.
Yeah, and, we'll speak about what's at stake in just a moment, but that point is worth noting. After South Africa made its representations at the ICJ, Advocate Mannya, there was all kinds of responses from Israeli officials, both inside and outside court, perhaps, but more broadly, South Africa was kind of branded as this kind of legal arm for Hamas. And I suppose as we try and make sense of that, it's worth going back to the definitions as envisioned by the Genocide Convention of what genocide and genocidal intent suggests. And it's all outlined in Article 2, I think, of this convention, where genocide is being defined as the killing of members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of this group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent births within this group and forcefully transferring children of the group to another group. I mean, on the basis of just how this is outlined in the Genocide Convention, I wonder to what extent you reckon South Africa was able to, through piecemeal, speak to these different points in making their point.
Yes, I must say, South Africa made quite a compelling case. And the reason why the case was compelling is that the facts are glaring. They speak for themselves. I think we should not be confused by what the state of Israel is and what it stands for. It is a barbaric entity. It has got no regard for human rights. It's got no remorse. It can kill children. It can bomb hospitals. It can prevent people getting water. It can switch off electricity. It can take young, innocent men, conscript them, force them into the Gaza Strip to commit atrocities. I think that's what we must understand about the state of Israel. But we must also understand that it's got international terrorists supporting it. We know the people who went into Iraq under the pretext that there were weapons of mass destruction. We know that it was a geopolitical agenda. So we should not be confused about the argument which are said. Having said that, there are many people of Jewish descent who have openly and publicly condemned the conduct and the actions of the state of Israel. So we should not be confused. We are not a pariah state. We were under apartheid. Israel is an aggravated apartheid state, and we know that they have violated every piece of international law. They have violated every single international human rights instrument. So the facts are there. They speak for themselves. And if the court were to apply the law to the facts, it should at least grant some of the provisional measures. And as my colleague has said, there's nothing really unreasonable. What is it that would prevent the judges of the ICJ to say these people must have access to medication, they must have access to food and water? Remember, Israel has said deliberately they want Palestinians uprooted. They've been saying to them, you now have to move south because we are coming. You must now move west because we are coming. That is genocide. The hospitals that were bombed, we now know that there are no tunnels. There's no Hamas under those hospitals. We know the people from Israel have themselves said that. So the facts are compelling. It is a compelling case to protect humanity. Yeah. If the ICJ doesn't, then we have a new definition of human rights. We have a new definition of humanity.
It comes as no surprise that, of course, this is a story that's on the front pages of some newspapers this morning, including the Cape Times. And part of what they've done is quote a jurisprudence lecturer from UNISA who goes on to mention that, the statutory requirements for genocide obviously feature prominently in a case like this. But there's also geopolitics. She speaks of a balance of power between Western imperialists and, if you like, the global South to some respect. And I wonder how you reckon the ICJ is going to negotiate that aspect of this case here, Ayesha. Because whether or not we want to believe that there are some kind of political influences at the World Court, many will tell us that they inevitably bleed through, at least when judges have to make their own deliberations.
Absolutely, that's true. And, one must take on board that in order to get this provisional measures appeal granted for South Africa, we would need at least 8 of the current judges sitting on the ICJ to vote in favor of applying some, if not all, the provisional measures South Africa has asked for. I think there is no doubt that the case for genocide was made very well. However, as you said, the geopolitical influences, the international relations influences, the fact that the US, the UK, and Germany, among others, have actually continued to arm Israel to continue to implement this genocide and the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, let us not forget, is of importance here. It's an economic issue as well, particularly for the U.S., as well as a political issue. So yes, there's a very strong Zionist, I'm not saying Jewish, a very strong Zionist lobby in the United States and to a lesser extent in the UK and the rest of Western Europe. But as well, there is an economic imperative. There is the military-industrial complex in the United States that is at issue here. And, of course, for the other countries. In addition to that, the judge president of the ICJ is a former U.S. bureaucrat. So it is likely that she will vote as a U.S. bureaucrat would. There are also issues between international relations, diplomatic issues between South Africa and some of the other countries who have judges at the ICJ. Among these, Uganda, Morocco, China on the issue of the Uyghurs. It's going to be interesting to see how those countries, among others, will vote, whether they will put aside their other diplomatic disputes with South Africa to vote in favor of human rights and in favor of international human rights and flagrant violations of humanitarian law, or whether they will put their personal one-on-one disputes with South Africa ahead of those.
Yeah. You know, in making their case, South Africa, I beg your pardon, mentioned in part that what is at stake here is not only the plight of the Palestinian people, but also the very standing of international law. And Advocate Mannya, I wonder for you whether or not that signals a kind of inevitable outcome around this particular case, if in fact the ICJ is convinced that international law itself is being argued. That's what's at stake.
Yes, I understand. The law is as good as the institutions which enforce it. And I think my colleague has provided a very interesting context. You must understand that to be a judge at the ICJ, you need a majority support of both the Security Council and the United Nations voting at the same time. Now, you can almost understand that it does not follow that you have people who are objective or independent, whatever the case may be. You actually may have people who enjoy the support of their countries or who are not supported by certain countries, and therefore the court is not necessarily, strictly speaking, a court as you would find the High Court in any other country. It's also trapped in politics. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, part of the failure in international law, in international human rights law, is the situation of the United Nations and generally its agents. And there have been calls for the transformation of the United Nations because it introduces inefficiencies in the prosecution of human rights and international law. So at the end of the day, and I think one thing we must not even get confused about is whether South Africa has made a compelling case. They have made a compelling case. Whatever outcome has got nothing to do with the presentation, particularly the legal part which South Africa made. It will be based on some other issue, and it will redefine, and I think this issue is redefining world relations. As you know, there's been attacks. Germany has made some very silly statements about how South Africa seeks to abuse the issue of the genocide. I mean, clearly, as my colleague says, it's got to do with the relation between those who are permanent oppressors and those who are permanently oppressed. And I think it's going to redefine the relations. Ultimately, it will not have to do anything with international law. We will need to get the systems and the structures to be functional, to give meaning and effect. The conventions are there. They are very clear, capable of interpretation, no doubt about it.
Sure. And of course, that ruling is expected at around 2:30 South African time. We'll all be watching in some respects with bated breath, given what's at stake. Advocate Modidima Mannya, thanks for your time. Ayesha Kajee for weighing in. We also appreciate your insights. Thanks very much indeed.